the Open Forum. And we're working at the moment to establish the Open Forum website. It's going to start, hopefully next week is going to be operational. We're going to have a computer here so you can browse the archive freely outside of the projection format. Yeah, we have some publications concerning the people that visited us the last 30 years. And hope you enjoy it and come back. And we're having where is it? Sorry, I'm a bit tired. Yeah, we're having a poetry evening the 29th of March. Poetry of the Forums. Starting at 6, and hopefully, or for sure, it will start at 6:05. Yeah, you're welcome. Take the program and come back. I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about it. Yeah.
So tonight we have the great pleasure to welcome Joernmark. He's going to show his photographies that are now exhibited at Buga in the exhibition Diabis. It's concerning places that have been abandoned during the crisis. And this doing this exhibition together with Annika from Oslo. So enjoy and don't hesitate to ask questions after.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a few people still coming in. I don't know. People are walking around, thinking about doing something else. Having been a university lecturer all my life, I've always been a bit concerned that the class is at ease when I start, but I start right away. I'm going to talk for about half an hour about my project that I live with since 2005, and the books and the exhibitions that has been reported. I was supposed to talk. Concentration is part of it, and it's a bit hard being concentrated when people are walking around. Okay, this project that I've been working with since 2005 is really a part of my work. I used to be, and I still am, a university lecturer in Gothenburg. I'm an economist by profession, and I got a PhD in economic history back in early 1990s. I wrote about structural change in the European steel industry, what happened during the 1970s and 1980s, and when the steel industry in most of Western Europe and North America was heavily restructured. You might say that, for example, in the United Kingdom, about 90% of the labor force was laid off, and a large number of steel mills and so on were put to rest. They were laid. And I wrote about this great European industrial restructuring. Of course, you had the shipyards, you had the steel industry, you had the coal industry, and so on. And I say that during the 1950s and 1960s, it was flourishing. The European economy was growing very fast. And then during the 1970s and 1980s, the early part of globalization struck. And it was part of the Swedish experience, and it was part of the Belgian experience, and of course it was part of the Norwegian experience as well. And I wrote about this as an academic. I wrote about it for about 10 or 15 years. I wrote a large number of books about it, which of course nobody read, but I made quite normal academic career. I became a professor, an associate professor at Joernmark in Gothenburg. And then, just by chance, I started to digitalize my work in the around 2004, 5, 2006. And I think that that's the most important part that I will talk about for art students and so on, because I think digitalization is a very, very important part of how we can present your work. And even for me, being the most boring academic that you can think about, the possibilities that was opened up really by digital technology, that was what made it. Because the project has been about what I used to work as an economist. The really only difference was that I put pictures to it. The pictures that you're going to see here are from Detroit. Detroit has become part of the Western folklore, because Detroit has been struck by globalization and economic change even more than, I think it's the worst part that you can find in the Western world. Detroit in 1950 used to have about 2 million inhabitants. Today you're down at something like 730,000. That is that you are about 2/3 of your population. And of those that are still remaining, the school board of the United States, the estimation is that about 47% of the population in Detroit are analphabets, that they're not able to read or write. It says that a city that used to be one of the most prosperous in the Western world, you said 2 million inhabitants, today are inhabited by about 730,000 people that are not able to read and write. So Detroit is the perfect example, and it was the example in my book, The 80s, Art Journal. I use this as an example of how globalization struck and how economic change struck around the Western world. And it's the ideal example in that way. But what happened in Detroit can be transferred to any other Western city, in Oslo, Stockholm. The only thing in Oslo and Stockholm and Gothenburg and so on, Hamburg, whatever you want, was that these cities were better able to handle these forces. They're still confronted with the same forces that Detroit were. Looking at the pictures, first of all, these are pictures that I took during a trip for 3 days. All of these pictures are taken during a 3-day trip in Detroit in early May 2011. First one depicts the Aztec ballroom. It's one of several large ballrooms that you can find in different corners of central Detroit. Built during the 1920s. In the 1920s, Detroit was one of the 4, 5, 6 richest cities in the world. In 1913, 1914, Henry Ford had built the first real car plant. And of course, in this Ford plant, the workers were paid better wages than anywhere else in the world. And of course, the population that grew so fast in Detroit during these years, around the Ford plants, around the General Motors plants, around the Chrysler plants. Really what it was that it was the best paid blue-collar workers in the world, which means that these people had an enormous amount of money to spend. Which means that when you built these entertainment palaces, which is really easy, you had to put in your best in order to get the people there. Look at the ornaments up here. Look at anything here. This was a grand. It was a really grand ballroom during the 1920s and so this. Benny Goodman used to play here. Really, the last band that played here in the early 1970s was the Velvet Underground. I checked it up and it was during the 1920s, 30s, 40s. People like Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller and so on, they played the Aztec ballroom because this was the place in the world where we were paid best. It took about 2,000 people there, could fill it up with 2,000 people. Look at the lamps up there. You can see it as the 1920 version of today's Las Vegas, built in these kind of theme places in order to attract people to come and watch and so on. And then it all falls into the heavy state of decay during the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Nobody does any kind of renovations here during the 50s or 60s or so on. Really, it's put in some kind of time warp because Detroit enters on a period of eternal decline during the 1950s. Then it's confronted with economic change, which I used to write about as an academic, and which I today take these pictures of and still tell the same kind of story. Look at the next picture, another picture of the roaring 1920s in Detroit. Next picture, please. It's one of the big rental apartment houses that I photographed in Detroit during these days. You can find these kind of large apartment houses around the city. Can count it to probably several hundreds. I photographed, I made a collage of this, I think about 40, 50 or something like that, in 2 pages of the art journal. Because they are filmed all over Detroit. This kind of grand houses from the 1920s, they are empty, they are left to gather, not even rust, they are really left to fall apart, built in around 1925. And Moorish kind of style there. And this is built about just 400 meters from this, 400 meters from the Henry Ford T-Ford plant. So the people here in Highland Park, which is the name of this part of Detroit, people in Highland Park, yeah, sure, that was the richest working population that we had in any part of the world. Today, in this part of the city, Highland Park, used to be 52,000 inhabitants there. Today there are 12,000 remaining. It used to be 80% white. Today it's 98% black. Can you walk inside? Have a picture from inside. Next picture, please. This is how it looks when you go through the gate there. Look at this. Look at the wooden panels there. It's exquisite. The best kind of styling for fine everywhere. It's built for just ordinary people in Detroit in the 1920s. This is what they had to do in order to attract people to the rental houses. And then nothing happens. It's left in this, like an Aztec ballroom. Nobody has done any kind of renovations there during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. That's why it looks like it's been the still is the 1920s in here. 1920s in heavy decay. You can see that nobody lives here. You can see that in the fire. It was left, and I was there in May, it had been left about 6 months earlier. And this is what 6 months do in Detroit. It starts to fall apart completely. So why did this happen? Why did it fall apart like this? Why did Detroit decline in this kind of fashion? Yeah, reason, first of all, is that the same kind of car that built Detroit, this car also killed it, because what happens during the 1950s, even as early as the 1940s, is that the city starts to thin out. It starts to spread in all kinds of directions. Detroit is one of the first cities in the world where you construct a large motorway system. It's kind of autobahn or motorways. Yeah, Germany is there, but Detroit is even earlier. They start to build the urban motorway system as early as 1941. And almost from the start, the industry, manufacturing industry, car plants and so on, starts to move out to the motorway system because it's much better logistical to do it. You can construct the cars out there, you can transport them away. The productivity is much higher if you build the new factories on the motorways instead of the almost inner city. Today in the inner city of Detroit, I still find the remnants of the Packard plant or the Studebaker plant and so on. They are still within the cities in Nash plant and so on. The pictures of them in the pictures of them in the book and so on. And this kind of early car plants that were left in the late 1950s. They couldn't stand the challenge from the new plants that were built along the motorways. And of course, when the plants were built out there, the people moved there as well. The workers moved to new suburbs. This kind of new suburbia that is growing out in different parts of the world. What happens is that Detroit is starting to spread out like, some would say, cancer, filling up regions, a whole region like Ostfold or something like that. Detroit is thinning out, and the old inner city can't handle it. People are moving out. The malls are established. That is that the malls are established. It means that the old shops are having to close down. And of course, in that case, when people are moving out to the suburbs, what's going to happen to the old apartment buildings? Yeah, people don't want to live there anymore. It's very hard to attract new people to the apartments. And what happens then is that instead they have to try to find new people that can live there. And that during the 1950s and 60s then, and the white people are leaving for the suburbs and the new factories. What's happening is that you have a migration in the US. Much like the migration that you have today in Africa and Europe, and people from North Africa heading from Western Europe. The American version of that is that during the 50s, 60s, people are moving from the southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and moving to the northern states, Chicago, Detroit, so on. And these black people, when they come to Detroit or Chicago, of course they get much less paid jobs in the service sector. And these are the people that you can attract to these old buildings. Which means that you will have to fill up the places with much more people. And it also means that you won't do the same kind of renovations as if you had the old workers in there. So what you create is really a slum, because you can't handle the integration in this kind of cities. And what happens is that they will start to decay, and the population, as I said, will thin out. And it's a kind of fantastic process to cover like areas, especially in Detroit, because you can see the different layers of this change. This is the decline of the 1950s and 60s, really. And the white people are leaving, and you don't renovate anymore. And you're creating the slums, and you're creating the conditions for the riots that happened in 1967 and 68. This led to an even more dramatic decline in the white population. Even the black middle class is starting to leave in the 1970s and 80s. And of course, white and black middle, of course, because you can't remain in a city where more and more the people aren't able to read and write, and then more and more people are living their lives on crack or something like that. You'll have to leave, because you don't want your kids to stay in a city like that. You're soon going to see the schools, but I can say that airport, rental buildings, schools, whatever, is the same kind of destruction, the same kind of urban reality that you see. Because Detroit wasn't able to gather a new momentum in this process of city thinning, and in this kind of process of, they couldn't handle the segregation problems, and what they did was that they fell apart. Next picture, please. Picture of a diner from the 1950s, really a part of the new motorway system. This one is built on one of the motorways, the new motorways, and it's built in a part of rather close to the central city. It means that being close to the central city, nobody wanted to stay here as early as during the 1980s or 1990s. The diner it was harder and harder to attract customers, which means that it was left in a kind of pristine condition from the 1950s up till it closed down in somewhere around February 2011. And the same thing here. It's built in the 1950s along the new motorway. It's built too close to the city center. Nobody's going to invest here. Nobody's going to renovate it. You have to gather less and less and less customers. Which means that then you find, I don't think you can find diners like that anywhere in America, but in Detroit. It's kind of beautiful in a way. I don't think it exists anymore because it's probably been burned down today. Detroit is burning more or less continuously. The people are left there. They have a local 72 years old, started this during the early 1970s. It's called Hell Night, and it's Hell Night is around Halloween. What you have is organized gangs of youngsters that are driving around Detroit on Halloween night, and they are torching buildings systematically. So on Halloween, Detroit is burning, which means that large areas of Detroit are really empty today, where there have been houses and where there have been diners and so on. It's this is one of the cities that turned into the city that has turned into a real urban jungle. Next picture, please. This is one of the schools. My wife told me not to. I wrote about this in one of the galleries on my internet page. I wrote that if you haven't got anything else to photograph in Detroit, you can also photograph a school. My wife said to me that this is too cynical, Jan. You can't write like this, but it's true. And because it's like that in Detroit. If you haven't got anything else to do, you can also photograph a school. Thinking about it, 70% of the population leaving, but people with kids are going to leave in even greater numbers because, as I said earlier, you don't want your kid to grow up in a city where it has deteriorated like Detroit. I've been photographing schools where the first thing that you saw was the traces of the metal detector, because the kids were forced in the morning to go through a metal detector because they were having knives and guns and so on, which they used to threaten each other and the teachers and so on. And of course, nobody wants to have your kids growing up in a city like that. What you're going to do is you're going to leave for the suburb of Chicago or whatever, which means that the schools are left to something like 80 or 90%. The people that are remaining, these people that are analphabets, that are going on crack and that are method thieves and so on, because they don't pay that much taxes as well. This means that today we have a normal class size in Detroit of something like 50 or 55 pupils. Though there are a large number of abandoned schools. Another picture, please. This one is rather graphic. It's one of my favorite pictures from Detroit. It's something you just get amazed when you see it when you come home, because you don't see it when you, of course you have some kind of eye for it, but when you see it in your computer, there are lots of number of pictures that you just see that I didn't take it, it's someone took it some. During my years looking at it, in some kind of, how was I influenced here and so on. During my years as an economist, normal economist, I always had an interest in art, and what I liked was surrealist art. I liked abstract art, and looking at it today, I can see that much of these places and much of the pictures are really, it's like I said, it's like stepping into a picture of Joernmark3 or something like that. You enter into a world that don't exist, and where different kind of objects are mixed in a way that they shouldn't be. So, and actually, I started to do this in 2005. And it's a bit like today, I've become a bit addicted to finding these places. I have to step into a Joernmark3 painting each month. If I don't do it, I get a bit annoyed and dizzy and so on. It's a bit addictive, I would say that, because it's a very, very different, strange sense of reality that you get. It's a bit like civilization didn't happen, civilization falling apart, and certainly it's added to my life, I would say. No picture, please. Last parts of this is where the kids put their school books. The amazing thing about this one is that it's still there, because in Detroit, one of the most dangerous tribes of Detroit is the scrappers. That is the people that are stealing metal. You find the scrappers all over the place, and they're the most dangerous people that you can come across. And that they left this one is strange, really. I took the picture in May. I suppose it's gone today. You'll find these scrappers or crackers or whatever all over the city. And that's one of the reasons why you have to. What I've done, of course, is like when I started to do this, I became part of an international subculture called the urban exploration. And what you have to do is, if you want to photograph Detroit, is that you have to get into the subculture in some way. Because you can't go around Detroit if you're not accompanied by a local guy who knows his way around, knows where the scrappers are, knows where the crackers are. Yeah. If you have these kind of cracking gangs, when are they most active? Where are they, and so on? And if you have a local guy accompany you, he will know where to go. And also he will know which buildings are open on a special weekend. Because, take next picture please. This is one of the abandoned villas. Another one please. This is from the inside the Wurlitzer building, which is one of, it's called the Big 12, the 12 abandoned skyscrapers in Detroit. And I can, a building like the Wurlitzer, 16 floors, one of the skyscrapers of the 1920s, yeah, it's not going to be open all of the time. The city of Detroit will seal it off and so on. And if you are accompanied by a local guy from Detroit, he will know which of those houses are open, where can you photograph, where is it dangerous and so on. That's one of the reasons why you need to be part of a subculture to do this. And also this is the Wurlitzer, as I said, one of the legendary big 12 skyscrapers. This is the latest saloon of the early 1960s. The skyscrapers are, I think it's one of the most fabulous things to photograph on a skyscraper, because skyscrapers are almost always very intact. The owner here left in the early 1980s because he couldn't afford to use the building anymore. The energy costs were too high. The tenants didn't pay the rent and so on. So he just leaves it. He takes the pictures and goes and leaves the building. And then, of course, who is going to be 16 floors high? Who is going to remove the ladies' saloon? Absolutely nobody. And these buildings, take another one please. It's still the same skyscraper. They are all like time capsules. This is left in 1980, which means that newspapers were full of news about the election campaign between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and all the calendars were from 1980 and so on. And it's like walking around in part of 1980, except for that the roof has been falling down for 30 years and so on. Next picture, please. 30 years has turned it into a picture by René Magritte or something like that. This is the 16th floor, where this is the Wurlitzer building, of course. This is the jukebox maker that had it. This is where they had their company, sold a million jukebox. They went to the 16th floor and had a big party. And then today, of course, after 30 years,